Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of the Kitabi Karwan Podcast. Today's podcast is in association with Bloomsbury Publishing India. Today, I have with me Abantika Ghosh, the author of Billions Under Lockdown, the inside story of India's fight against COVID 19. Generally, we have on this podcast writers who write fiction, sometimes non fiction, but this time around, Abantika stands out simply because she's covered something that is so relevant to each and every one of our lives. Avantika's book deals with the brutal COVID 19 pandemic that has swept across the globe over the past year and a half now almost. And in particular, talks a lot about the lockdown that was imposed in India last year. A little bit about Abantika before we get into the podcast. Abantika has worked with the Indian Express and is currently working with the print and has extensively covered India's health infrastructure for the past 10 to 15 years. So, without any further ado, let's jump right into it. Hi, Abantika. Welcome to the Kitabi Karwan Podcast. So, before I start, this question is going to be slightly odd in context of the book that you've written, but it's a tradition that I do at the podcast. I'm going to do this anyway. Uh, so, we know that you work at the print and you cover the health infrastructure of the country, and you used to work at the Indian Express. But can you tell us something about yourself which we won't find in on your book's blurb or on your print's profile or on the internet? Something that maybe people wouldn't know about you. Could be anything.
Hmm. I love the 7+ movies on Netflix, the ones that are for 7+ kids. Those are my favorite movies.
Have you seen Inside Out? That's one of my favorite movies of all time.
No, I haven't.
Oh, you should. You should. I think you'll enjoy it if you love like movies for 7+ kids. It's a really interesting idea where they talk. The movie shows different kind of this seven. I think Riley's the protagonist. Is about 10 or 11, and she's just shifted family shifted cities, and we get to see the emotions in her head, right? Like it's just this virtual world where they're trying. So there's anger, there's happiness, and how they interact. It's a very cute little movie that you'll enjoy. So,
I'll watch it.
yeah, I mean, so what got you into this specific stream of journalism, right? Like covering the health infrastructure. I mean, I was reading. I mean, you've been very thorough with your book and your coverage. But and I've had there were a lot of people, respected veterans of the industry, who've written that you are like your work is commendable when it comes to covering the health infrastructure of the country. So, what got you interested in this in the first place? I mean, did you enter journalism with a particular idea of kind of try to cover health infrastructure? Was it just something that came along the way?
It just happened because so when I came into journalism, I joined the Statesman Calcutta as an intern, and
Okay.
we just basically put on whatever beats there was. So we were interns. So whichever beat did not have the regular person, we would be put there. So then,
Right.
2 years later, when I shifted to Delhi, um, I think my boss had asked me. So I was on the desk initially because I didn't know Delhi, and for a reporter, it's very important that you know the city that you're covering. So I'd asked for 6 months to get to know the city, and then at the end of those 6 months, when he asked me, "What do you want to do?" So I said, I'm interested in many things and I have a degree in physiology. Maybe that's why he put me on health. I don't really know. But that's where it started. And um, so I have actually covered a lot of things, and that helped me a lot when I was writing the book. I I am primarily a health reporter, but I have also done a lot of politics. I have done gender. So, and those kinds of perspectives actually helped me sort of get the context right. I hope I've got it right in the book.
No, yeah, and that absolutely makes sense because, in fact, it was just the other day when I was talking to someone else about because people tend to look at the pandemic as a health issue, right? Like, I mean, it's a health crisis, which it primarily is, but there are way too many dimensions to it. I mean, something as basic as the economic dimension of it. So, like the very taunted K-shaped economy recovery that is coming about, and what are the economic consequences. And yeah, like the context of that discussion was about how as a country, we are doing nothing to prepare ourselves for the long-term economic fallout of this pandemic, to the extent that,
Yeah.
right, that there is no economic, like even this current budget that came out, and again, not to kind of go into the politics of it, like I mean, it's even at a state level, we don't see individual states trying to build a future plan, and to an extent you can forgive them because there's an overwhelming crisis at hand, but it's just worrying in that sense. So my next question to you would be that, given that you've covered, so covering something like politics or gender, which has a far more sociological bent of things, right? Which are a lot more commonsensical in their approach, or like logical and easier to understand, as opposed to health, which is far more technical. There's a lot more science involved. There's some degree of like opinions on either ends, like, whether this medicine works or not. How does this actually,
Hmm.
things like that. So what was it that you did to kind of equip yourself over these years to kind of handle something like this? Because I mean, you would find, I mean, people who write about politics, something that you do on ground, that you go and talk to politicians, you see the theories that they're playing out, or the same thing for gender. There's a lot more research work involved. You kind of look at empirical data or take a theoretical approach, but health just has this tinge of science behind it, which how difficult was it to navigate through the years?
So, nothing prepares you for a pandemic.
Yeah.
Nothing you ever do prepares you for a pandemic, especially now that we are going through the second wave in Delhi. Um, it's mentally exhausting. You know, people are dying. I've spent all of this morning trying to get a bed for a guy whose oxygen levels are at 83%, and I don't know if he got the bed. So that being the case, it's it is nothing you ever do in your life can prepare you to either cover a pandemic or even live through a pandemic. It's I mean, you just happen to stumble your way through. But I actually do not agree with a lot of what you say, especially when you say health is very scientific, or um yeah, part of health is, when you talk about health as medicine, maybe it's
Okay.
scientific.
Okay.
Even there, there's so what I want to say is health is intensely political. Health is about
Of course.
social fault lines. Health is, you know, I don't know what you understand by politics, but if politics is about um you know representing certain sets of people and certain sets of people being treated differently than others, then all those things happen all the time in health. Look at women. You know, there is available data to show that women in this country uh, are only organ donors. Overwhelming proportion are organ donors. Very, very minuscule proportion are organ recipients because nobody in the family is willing to donate to them. So that being the case, and I think one of the problems with health writing, science writing, has been this silo that um, we ourselves also sort of looked at us through that Lancet prism,
Okay.
whereas whereas our work has to be rooted in our own social and political realities. When you write something which is so detached, um,
Right.
there's a problem there, right? So
Right. Right.
why does misinformation, now that we are going through this phase of vaccine hesitancy, why does misinformation spread faster than information? Because the information is wrapped up in so much jargon that the
Right.
misinformation finds it easier to percolate human mind.
Right. Right. No, that makes absolute sense actually, because the more I think of it, that uh, it it's the academic like representation, like that's exactly what I was somewhat trying to get at, is that when someone simply presents academic data without actually giving it a context, which I think your work as a journalist allows you to do, and that kind of takes away from my idea of health being simply scientific and actually converts it into yours. of it having that context, whether it gives it a political dimension, as you mentioned. I actually wasn't aware about the statistic that you just mentioned, that women are largely organ donors rather than organ recipients. And yeah, I mean,
Also,
it's
also gender neutral surgeries, which should ideally have a 50-50 breakup.
right,
If you see, especially in private hospitals, you will
right,
see overwhelming number of men have those surgeries, especially expensive, high
right,
value surgeries.
right.
So this is all published. I mean, published in the sense there have been newspaper articles, and I'm sure some journals might have also written about it. So this is quite well known, actually.
Right. And so that actually brings me to another dimension of the line of questions I wanted to take with you, is that so often, again, here I'm speaking for a very minuscule part of the population, or say that the upper middle class kind of class bracket that you can call, which often has a very siloed view about these things, right? Something as basic as access to I think this is the first crisis which my generation, or like even uh, like say someone over the past 20 years has seen, where uh, say privileged people are also kind of facing struggles which people who are not privileged face on a daily basis for years on end, right? Lack of
Right.
access to beds, medicine. And that's probably, like, I know, an eye opener in that sense for a lot of people about the problems that the country is facing. So my question actually is very pointed in that sense. So over the past year, when you were covering the lockdown and reviewing infrastructural issues, one common, I'm not too sure of whether it's a fact or a rumor, was that statistically there was a lot more cases or spread of the virus in urban centers as opposed to rural areas, right? So in your empirical view of what you saw, was it largely a very uh, classist stance to take, simply because maybe the problem in rural areas was rather a lack of testing, or people just not having access to proper resources, or being able to identify whether it's the coronavirus spreading or just like an average flu related disease? Underreporting, what do you think there is an actual element of truth there, that this was actually happening? How does this play out?
This would have been a real possibility in February.
Right,
Okay. In February, if you'd asked me this question, I would have said, yes, that's perfectly possible. However, now, given the spread of the disease, given the way it is spreading everywhere, rural, urban, every state. I mean, Uttar Pradesh is set to be like one of the worst hit states in the coming days.
right, right.
So I don't think that happened last time. Last time, for some reason,
Mm-hmm.
um, it's possible. It is still possible to some extent what you said happened. But if that was the case, it would have been the case even now. But now there is data, government data, to show that it's spreading to villages, rural areas are affected, areas that were untouched are affected. Um, and see, the thing is, the last time the spread, even when the migrants went back home and all of that, because of the lag in, I mean, everybody was in the cities for differential amounts of time before they went home and all of that. Somehow they didn't carry the disease back home.
Right,
But this time it's there everywhere. Villages, I mean, Kumbh, uh,
right,
thousands of people have taken the disease back from Kumbh, and that's again a fact. State governments are saying that people are coming back from Kumbh and they're getting the disease back.
right,
Punjab, the protests, the farmers protest by there's a roster basically. So because you have
right,
work back home that can't stop, so you're here for a few days and you go back home. So all
right,
that coming and going has spread to Punjab villages.
right,
Um, Regardless of the tone and tenor of the conversations we see on Twitter, the
right.
virus doesn't discriminate. It doesn't discriminate
Yes,
between religion, between farmers,
yes,
rural, urban, anything.
right.
It is the most democratic thing possible.
And it's so that just brings me to like a very, I don't know, like I have absolutely no words to describe it, but then we've seen over this this particular wave, at least over the previous wave, there was some level of government response. We might debate what the quality of that response was or what its efficacy was. But this time around, there has been, to a large extent, a very visible washing of hands in that sense, right? I mean, you've seen a very hands-off approach from the central government in that sense. There has been complete disregard. I mean, whether you look at states trying to politicize issues or having rallies or the Kumbh for that matter, or the protests and everything happening. Do you think is so from again as I was reading your book, you did have the privilege of actually interacting a lot with officials who are genuinely in charge of things, not just someone who's giving the orders, but someone who's actually implementing them or in keeping abreast with it. Do you think there is a decided lack of empathy on part of the bureaucrats or the technocrats running the scene behind, running what's happening on the ground? Do you think there is intent but like a lack of application in that sense, or do you think they've genuinely it's just a bad phase where everyone's just going 100% but still not able to solve these things? Because very honestly for me, the way I'm putting it this way is because for someone who just watches the news or gets all their information from social media or their interactions, the situation's dire, and it's very easy for me to right now just say, oh, the government's doing nothing, right? But for some, I would much rather have an informed opinion on this rather than just believing whatever that's out there.
So empathy, I don't think is, if you talk about the bureaucracy as a whole, I don't think empathy is their strongest suit. But what happened this time is that they were caught completely unawares. We are opening up vaccinations for all adults from 1st of May. I think less than 2 months ago, when I asked a very senior person, bureaucrat, that question, that, so why don't you open up for everybody? And he said, no, I mean, we never said we'll vaccinate all citizens. And also, by the time the turn comes for all adults to be vaccinated, the virus may not even be there. Somehow we had believed that we would be this complete outlier where the virus just has one. And so, I stopped the book on 16th of my preface was written on 16th of January when the vaccination, for that was the first day of vaccination. And there's a reason why I stopped there, because in my mind, I had no doubt there would be a second wave. World over, there have been second waves. What took me by surprise this time is the fact that we have this huge second wave. Everywhere second waves have been bigger than the first wave. But in all of those places, the second wave came before vaccines.
Right.
We are an exception because we have this huge spike 3 months. 3 months after we started vaccinations. And for 3 months, we brought back all our learnings of the Inspector Raj into the vaccination program, be it who can receive it, who can buy it, who can procure it, what do you sell it for. You are the monopoly, I am the monopoly buyer, so I will dictate my prices to you and I will not let anybody else procure from you. I will not let anybody else enter the country because I'm going to be the only country which is vaccinating all its people with just made in India vaccines. These sorts of completely irrational and I mean, I mentioned this in my book also, the complete lack of rationality in the way we have dealt with the pandemic, not just now. Now we are seeing the very brutal consequences of that. But it's been the hallmark of the way we have dealt with this all this while. And this is just continued. So I think they were just, I mean, this is a result of inefficiency. This is a result of believing in our own exceptionalism without any scientific evidence whatsoever. This is the result of putting every aspect of pandemic management to experts who are not qualified to do that. There are people who are better suited for this, but we were not banking on them. If you talk to epidemiologists, even within the government, they are so frustrated. Not just now, they've been frustrated for months. I asked one of them were you consulted before allowing Kumbh to happen or before allowing elections to go on? And he told me, no, we were asked to do SOPs, we did SOPs.
Wow.
That's the kind of top down approach. You know, people study certain things for a reason. They're called experts for a reason. If all degrees, like Twitter makes it out to be, if all degrees were useless, if all educated people were idiots, then this world would have been a different place.
Right. And I mean, as much as I agree with you, that's just the odd part of it, right? I mean, as much as I want to keep this podcast away from politics, the idea still remains that
I don't want to keep it away from politics.
not this.
Seen politics play out over dead bodies in the last few days.
I apologize for my statement. That was for not this particular episode. It's about for the the podcast I host in general. As I was continuing, I don't like, as much as I want to do that, I can't do it anymore. Like, particularly when we talk about the pandemic, it's impossible to do that. Something that I completely agree with what you say, right? As a lawyer myself, I know the kind of, like, I face this frustration on a very odd level whenever there's a controversial law that comes out or a judgment that comes out and how people interpret it. But that's been the approach of this government, right? Like, since 2014, the NDA 2 has just been, their approach has simply been that, common sense approach is what works. And, academics or people who study, they have theoretical knowledge. They don't really know what actually happens on ground. And that is why we use our commonsensical approach to things. And I think that positions you very interestingly, because you've covered both politics and this pandemic and health infrastructure in general. As much as I agree with you, right? Like, often data, the most empirical form of data in that sense is something election. The core down a bit that if a government does badly, it should be removed, right? Like, if their actions aren't good enough, right? And we've not had a lot of elections during the pandemic or post it, and we are still awaiting Bengal results. But there has been, like, if you just take, like, the municipal elections or basic by-elections of state or at state levels, or what happened in Madhya Pradesh last year, it's clear that, well, people are still voting for the incumbents despite their mishaps or the way they are screwing about with things, right? What do you think? Here's where I fail to grasp things. Earlier, it could have been said that, that maybe the lesser privileged are affected differently, and the privileged ones who are actually ended up voting for these people are still buying into it. But over the past year, we've seen a situation where even privileged people should have ample reasons to not vote for them.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Do you vote?
Yes, I do.
All your friends vote?
Yes, like they have. On, like, last election they did, the state elections they did. I'm not too sure if they voted on the municipal elections we had.
So in my experience, I have seen a lot of my non-journalist friends do not vote, and part of the reason why governments that do not do the work that they are elected for or manage to rake up electorally beneficial issues just ahead of elections one way or the other, why they keep coming back is because people like us, educated people, tend to stay away from from voting booths. That's one reason. The second reason is even the educated in our country are very gullible when it comes to certain issues. When it comes to somehow the atmosphere is such that if you talk religion, you will be able to sway large numbers of people, however that works. So I think, and also again, public memory is very short. So I've been discussing with my friends here, all of us who have been covering I mean, who've been journalists for many years now, that this is exactly like demonetization, the kind of things that we are seeing around us, the mess that has been created, the man-made disaster. But unfortunately, by the time elections happen, I think people would have again forgotten, or if people have not organically forgotten, a climate will be created when they forget all about this and they vote on some random something, some army action, something, whatever.
I was just about to say Balakot.
Yeah.
Yeah. But okay, so let me just take a step back from all of this and ask you a question about your writing process. Because of the very fact that, I mean, clearly, and as they should be, these issues are very deeply personal, political, and are often just very draining, not just mentally and physically, but emotionally as well, right? Something, I mean, I can't even begin to empathize with your work to the extent that just seeing these pictures online or like hearing about these things make me almost just sad about this situation. I'm very sure about someone like journalists or people who are actually on ground, doctors are going through a very different kind of trauma. uh in that sense, and this is not just about your book, right? Because you write beyond, as you work as a journalist. How do you handle this? Like, is there a process that you follow to kind of process the despair, I suppose, I guess. I mean, as you mentioned, right, like demonetization happened, this apathy happened, but there appears to be no way out. I don't know, just
Mm, so so far as the writing the book is concerned, things were not this bad then. I
no,
mean,
right,
when I wrote the book, it was nothing. Everything
right.
was, I mean, still under control. The numbers were high, that's all right.
Mm,
But right now people are dying like flies. That is what I find. So I mean, 2 days ago, so within a span of about 12 hours, I lost 3 colleagues. So that's the
right.
kind of devastation that is happening now. So it's, when I was writing the book, I was not processing this kind of mental anguish.
Okay.
But now, how I'm able to sort of come back to my work after all of this, and or stop my work in the middle to try and arrange for some bed, and frankly, I haven't been able to do anything for the last 1 week for anybody, because I, this morning when I sent a message to a senior health ministry official, the reply that came was, there are no beds, ma'am. And this was for that guy that I mentioned, 83% oxygen. So that's how bad it is. But what probably keeps me sane, is that I have 2 dogs. So that kind of takes my mind away from a lot of things.
Right.
And I mean, I really don't know. I actually don't know if I am coping. Um,
Okay.
it'll probably be clear over a longer period whether I'm coping or not, because currently my mental state is not very good.
Right.
So I don't know. Let's see how it works.
Okay. Okay. I'm sorry if I mean, overstepped with that question. I mean, it's not something that was
No,
the
that's fine.
intention behind it.
That's fine.
Right. So the other thing that I wanted to actually ask you was, and I did this quick thing on my Instagram, like when we confirmed that we'll be doing this podcast. I asked a few people, like I just put out a call that I'll be interviewing you, and I just put out your details that she's a journalist who covered the lockdown, and what possible questions we can ask. And one of my friends reached out to me and raised an interesting question. So something that we've seen over the past 5-6 years is that, uh, particularly under Modi, is that Modi enjoys a charisma which a lot of politicians are envious of, to the extent that like particularly like demonetization. There's this thing that goes around, right? Modi ji ne kiya hai to soch ke kiya hoga. There's this blind belief in whatever he's
Yeah.
doing or saying. Wo follow kar lo. That is what we ought to do. But this time around, like with the entire pandemic, and we've been seeing this right from the start, that even when he announced a lockdown, he did multiple those grand 8 p.m. Surprise, this thing where he would just come and announce something, or constant messaging where you should not please go get the vaccine, please don't step out, maintain social distancing. Uh, Still, there was a lot of hesitancy on that part. This was one place where people actually did not follow through on something that was directly out there. That there was this disappearance of this blind belief. Do you think there was, like, as a government and even at the state level, obviously this goes beyond this thing, there was a problem in the kind of messaging we spoke about? I mean, I did, in your book, you do mention how we should have, like, there were experts who spoke about how we shouldn't have marketed this or like put it out as a pandemic, right? As not as a mahamari, but as a general disease. You don't tell people that it's a killer and frighten them. This idea of using fear as a tool was a bad one. Do you think, apart from that, the government has failed in its messaging or in just conveying of how how its approach is, or its efficacy of its approach to handle this pandemic?
I was talking to this virologist recently, and he told me something very interesting. He said people are like kids. They don't hear what you say. They see what you do.
Right.
So while you are saying please mask up, you're going and holding election rallies and road shows without masks with tons and tons of people. Tons is, I mean, whatever, millions of people.
Right.
And you're organizing Kumbh. And you expect people on the road to mask up. Right. Because the pandemic has not gone away.
Right.
I mean,
and but so, I mean, fair enough. I accept that. I mean, that's something that I knew about, like, when the central government was concerned. But we've seen this at a state level also, right? I mean, for that matter, say, like, I am in Mumbai, and so Shiv Sena has been, like, to that extent, I'm just very specifically talking about the government that I have empirically seen. Maharashtra has been at the epicenter for the past couple of months, and even initially was, and we've have cases spreading like crazy. And but here, at least, the state level leadership has been very vocal about not wanting to do these things, and have tried to, like, I mean, have done at least a better job compared to the central government, not in terms of not pushing for these public events. Still, I feel there is this, the messaging is not, like, reaching the people. What is it? What's this divide, right? Like, I mean, the message has largely been unambiguous. Like, we have the chief minister speaking in, like, so something that I was very appreciative of, and which a lot of elite people criticize online about Uddhav Thackeray's, like, he made a couple of announcements on television, and they were in Marathi. And for me, that was a great thing, because when the chief minister of a state kind of underlines the seriousness of the disease and the problems that the state is facing in the vernacular, it reaches the deepest corner of the state, right? And
right.
I expected that to have a much larger effect than what it did. It actually did not do a lot of uh, damage control in that sense. So I know I'm kind of struggling to grasp why is this happening. It is, I mean, I do see it I don't disagree with you when you say about, like, there being rallies in the West Bengal or the Kumbh, but at a localized level, they're still not that sound for.
So, there was pandemic fatigue. I'm sure I am fatigued. There was pandemic fatigue. People had to get back to their livelihoods. You were basically asking people to stay away from work and not giving them anything for their sustenance. People had to come back. Somewhere they had to come back. And so far as messaging is concerned, sometimes you have to incentivize. You have to change the face. Maybe rope in celebrities. Make it more interesting. Maybe just Uddhav Thackeray, no matter how popular he is, just Uddhav Thackeray talking, even in the local language. After a point of time, it just, I think, gets to a deaf spot where you're not listening anymore. I know for a fact that it can happen with the best communicators, and I mean, we have better in the country than Uddhav Thackeray. So I think there was a need to make it more interesting and keep saying the same thing over and over again in different ways. For example, yesterday I was in my terrace, and there was this sort of Bhojpuri music playing, and we are
Mhm.
in a lockdown. So I was thinking, what is this? What is this? Who is playing music now?
Mhm.
So and I waited to see, and it was clearly a moving vehicle. So it was a Delhi police vehicle, and they were playing some sort of music. And then they had announcements about the lockdown, that you have to close down at this hour, please go home and whatever. But I stood there for the vehicle to arrive because they were playing that music.
Right.
It was more effective than three constables roaming the streets with a lathi and beating up people.
Right. Right.
So public health communication is a very it's a very specialized thing. It needs a lot of finesse. um, and one of the things that I have, and I mentioned this in my book also, one of the things that I have serious issues with is this thing of making policemen your frontline public health communicators.
Right.
Leave alone public health, policemen don't even know how to communicate normal stuff, and
Right.
public health is very specialized.
Right.
um we that's probably one of the reasons why we got off those habits so soon. There were
Right.
others, obviously, but
Of course.
if you want to stick just to communication, there were
Mhm.
some serious flaws in the way we communicated.
Right. So again, and because it just brings me back to where we. So I mean, obviously there's just always going to be this question for years now, that, and which you do also talk about in your book, that did we go, like, this is going to be a question forever, that did we go into the lockdown too soon? Was it uh required at that particular point of time? Could there have been a much better way of handling it? Because all around there has been a very clear, unambiguous, uh I know, consensus in that sense, that the lockdown largely, regardless of when it should have been enforced, was a failure. It did not kind of solve the situation at hand, right? And B, it kind of set us back. We don't know as of now how much, but by a lot of years, in all sense of the words, whether socially, economically. Particularly, like, I remember reading, I think, an editorial in the Hindu or the Indian Express, which spoke about this, about how uh, the number of, something like how much abuse, domestic violence abuse, just shot through the roof. And simply because you asked people to stay at their houses, there was no ability for them to get out of those situations and things. And that's just one of those things. The other being that, well, practically all other diseases have disappeared, like disappeared in terms of data collection or mentioning in statistics. Like, we were going through a tuberculosis pandemic in that sense for years, and now we just don't know what's happening. What do you think is the way forward now? Like, I mean, clearly the central, at least governments, are very still hesitant to declare full lockdowns, even though they do have effective lockdowns or curfews. They are still very hesitant around using that word. Obviously, something as the real way forward, obviously, which is the long-term reforms of having more primary healthcare centers, are, as they are, long-term. Like, what in your practical experience, or in your interactions with, uh, experts in the field, indicate is the way forward? What can be done immediately or over the next week or 2 weeks to kind of start arresting this wave?
I think we are, at least we in Delhi, are in the situation which classically calls for a lockdown.
Right.
You need somehow to bring cases down so that the health infrastructure can get back to treating them. People are right now dying without oxygen, without beds. You just need them to stay at home so that no new infections happen, so that you can somehow get your act back. But we also have to understand that what we are seeing now is actually these infections would have happened 15 days ago. Those
Right.
are the infections that we're seeing now.
Right.
For this lockdown to show results, it would be another 15 days. So we've been in a lockdown since last Saturday. So it's been
Hmm.
a week. So it'll be at least another week before the lockdown shows any results.
Right.
So I don't think um I really don't think we'll get a grip of this wave. This wave is and one just hopes that this is the worst wave and there is not one even worse coming up. I mean, that's my prayer. I actually don't believe in God, but I mean, I'm willing to do anything right now to sort of um just this should be it. It shouldn't get any worse than this. But I'm afraid this wave is going to play itself out without us being able to do too much about anything.
Right.
um but going forward, I think we need to really, this is a cliche, but there is no other way of saying this. After all the noise that we created about this being a health budget, the actual increase in allocation for the Ministry of Health this year was 7%.
Okay.
So with that kind of money, you don't do anything. You don't do any new setups, primary health. You have no
Okay.
money. Basically, it's nothing.
Right. Right.
So we really need to understand that big talk can only get you that far.
Right.
End of the day, you have to put your money where your mouth is.
Right.
Your mouth alone will not win a pandemic.
Mhm.
So, but I really don't see how we can put a stop to the damages during this wave. This wave, at least in Delhi, the way I see it, is going to be completely at the mercy of the virus.
Right. So, Avantika, just to step back from this again. So as in my experience with most people who end up writing a book or like journalists, they often love to read, right? So what is it that you like to read? I mean, is it that do you like to read a lot of non-fiction, fiction? Could you just tell us a little bit more about that?
Oh, I like to read. I read a lot of political non-fiction. So I'm currently reading
Yeah.
Pranab Mukherjee's
Um,
books.
right.
Yeah. So when I went for my book signings, I also bought Jane Austen. There's just one book that she wrote that I don't have,
Right.
so I bought that.
Mm,
Um, I mean, I'm actually a very eclectic reader. I really read what comes my way. I mean, I sometimes can't finish books.
okay.
I also like fiction, but when I read fiction, I tend to sort of go back a lot. So I like a lot of classics. I
Mhm,
have read very little modern like stuff that's written now, fiction. I've read very little of
mhm.
that. I'm a big Harry Potter fan. So yeah, so I generally I pick up books. I mean, I like reading books on cooking, um,
Right.
all kinds of things. Not cookery books, books on cooking.
Oh,
Uh,
that's a
so
very that's a very peculiar taste in books, and that's great. I mean, I think it's very difficult for people to classify themselves as what kind of books they read. But if I may ask this question, if I could ask you to name one book or like a couple of books which really impacted you as a person, like that stood out in terms of defining how you look at life or how you look at your career or just in general, right? Something that just went beyond its general trope and actually became something really special for
I don't know, Harry Potter.
you. And why would that be? Like, I mean, if just out of curiosity,
Harry
I mean,
Potter
there
is
are.
it's a reflection of life in many ways. You've read Harry
Yes.
Potter, right?
Yes, of course. I have. So that's exactly
Okay.
why I asked the question.
So that choice,
Hmm.
you are the choice you make,
Hmm.
is true of all of us at all points of our lives.
Interesting.
And it's so, yeah, I need to show you this. I don't know if you can see it. Can you read this?
It's Expecto Patron.
Yeah.
Yes, I was.
And that's a very powerful spell.
Yeah,
I mean, and this is the time for Expecto Patronum.
yeah,
We're living
and
through that.
and so for me, the best part about that spell is that your Patronus reflects who you are as a person, right? Like, and
Yeah.
right in way it all. it goes so for a lot of people it just goes beyond like even in the book I was surprised because it shows you who you are even when you might not know who you are, right? And yeah, so the reason I asked you that question and even particularly about Harry Potter is because among all Potterheads the conversation I've had, I mean, there are a bunch of different reasons why people like Harry Potter. Like for a lot of them, it's just about, they're really associated with it growing up because they really love the writing and they could associate with the kind of struggles there are. Obviously, some take life lessons from it away. So that's why I jumped into that question. But Avantika, I think we'll wrap up now. I'll just ask you that the one last question which has been on my mind. Uh, so now given that you've written this book and I'm sure it's getting the reception that it needs to. I mean it's genuinely it has so something that we spoke about at the beginning, right? There's academic info is just jargon, and but this book has actually put a lot of things into context, and I'm like in fact I'm actually planning on buying a couple of copies and just circulating them among friends just to give them a good, I mean, give context to the conversation at the very least. Right? So do you have plans for any other like an upcoming book, maybe on like what possible? I don't know, like there are so many things that you could be writing about, right?
Yeah. So before the second wave, I was actually planning I don't know whether I would have ended up writing it, but I was planning to write a fiction series for kids.
No.
Um,
Okay.
I even had like a character in mind and all that, but
Mm-hmm.
now that's sort of gone. And now I'm thinking maybe I should write. I mean, there's so much to write about what's currently happening.
Right.
Um, it's so I talked about a lot of things in this book, which somehow, I mean, so actually, my uncle told me that your book it's too critical, but
Okay. Yeah.
now, so my uncle has certain political affiliations,
Fair.
leanings,
Fair.
but
Fair.
what is playing out now shows why that book was
Book
critical.
is critical. Exactly.
I wouldn't have wanted it to happen this way. I would have rather lived with the thing that the government did so well. She criticized the government, but
Right.
unfortunately, that's not how it's happened.
Right.
I mean, it's it's devastating what we are living through currently, and this was preventable. So I think the next book will have to be again about the pandemic.
As I mean, I completely get where you're coming from. I mean, there's absolutely no disagreement there, and as much as I know, like the next book is something that would again be very enriching in terms of my knowledge experience. I would just like somewhere deep down, I just hope that the situation recovers to that extent. Or I know I think you always end up hoping for the good things to happen, right? As you said, you'd much rather live a life where this did not happen, and you're like, okay, she criticized the government for no reason, rather than the opposite coming true. But thank you, Abantika, for joining us on the podcast. It was lovely having you. Thank you.
Thank you, Siddharth. It was very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast, do check out our content on our Instagram page at the rate Kitabi Karwan, on our YouTube channel, or on any other podcast platforms. Do reach out to us through the comments or on our email ID for any feedback or comments you have about our content. Thank you so much.